Hi, I'm Alka. I am a postdoc research fellow here at SCCP, Sadhguru Center for a Conscious Planet. So we've already started recording this event. And today, we are happy to welcome you to Sadhguru Center Speaker Series, where we present virtual lectures and discussions highlighting the research and explorations of our multidisciplinary community of scientists, global experts, and thought leaders. That's our team there. So for those of you joining us for the first time, SCCP is a multidisciplinary research center based at the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care, and Pain Medicine at BIDMC here in Boston. Our mission is to weave together science and spiritual wisdom through research, education, and outreach. And we aim to bring tools of well-being to both patients and healthcare providers to enhance consciousness, cognition, and compassion. As you can see, that's our tagline there. We offer wellness programs, conduct scientific studies in various communities, and bring together world leaders from diverse fields to collaborate and innovate health and well-being solutions. And there is a, Morgan has placed in the chat, if you want to learn more about our website, she's placed the link there. So our speaker series presentation today is on Harmonizing Hearts and Minds, the Cario-Neural Connection and the Impact of Yoga by Dr. Satish Arora, who works within the Department of Cardiology at Oslo University Hospital and at the Center for Heart Failure Research. He's also a valued member of the Norwegian Healthcare Investigation Board. Throughout this event, Dr. Arora will explore the relationship between the heart and the brain, describe how the heart-brain axis may relate to consciousness, and speak on yoga's impact on cardiovascular health via cardiology research tools and expertise. In his research, Dr. Arora focuses on the intricate interaction between the heart and the brain, and his publications reveal the transformative impact of yoga on cardiovascular health. So as we are having more people trickle in, I think we're ready. Whenever you are ready, Dr. Arora, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Elka. I assume you can see my screen?
Yes, all set.
Great. So again, good afternoon, and thank you to the Center for inviting me to give this talk on the relationship between the heart and the brain. I will be talking about the connection between these two organs and the impact of yoga on cardiovascular health. Now here's an outline of my talk. I'll be discussing and introducing you to the research which we have done at Oslo University Hospital during the last decade or so. I will then move on to discussing the connection between the heart and the brain and the four main signaling pathways. That is neurological signaling, biochemical signaling or hormonal signaling, as well as pulse wave signaling and the potential for electromagnetic signaling between these two organs. The third part of this talk will discuss the impact of yoga on cardiovascular health. I'll try to summarize the current evidence. Then finally, I'll touch briefly on the future directions for heart-brain research. Just a brief introduction to our hospital and department. Now, Oslo, Norway is a relatively small country, 5.5 million inhabitants. There are 6 teaching hospitals, of which Oslo University Hospital is the largest. Our department is the largest cardiology department in Europe, and we provide a whole range of clinical services and also have a heavy focus on research as well. Overall, about 1,250 publications since the year 2010. There are several research groups in our department. I'm attached to the group looking at inflammation and cardiovascular disease. And here are some of my colleagues focusing on, for example, cardiogenetics, integrated cardiovascular function, myocardial imaging, and invasive cardiology. Now I'm attached to the cardioimmunology group. This is also a very active group in terms of publications, around 500 publications since the year 2000. It is led by Professor Gullestad and the Department of Cardiology with the clinical expertise there. and works very closely with the Research Institute for Internal Medicine, which provides the basal sciences expertise. We also work closely with the section for immunology for their immunological expertise. So it's a very cross-disciplinary approach, and it has gained both national and international recognition. The primary aim remains to identify inflammatory mechanisms for cardiovascular disease. We focus on 3 patient groups, that is heart failure patients, heart transplant patients, as well as patients with traditional ischemic heart disease. This is our basic research model. Essentially, we start off looking at disease biomarkers in a specific population. This is developed into a working hypothesis of the underlying mechanisms, investigated further in either animal studies or in vitro studies. And this is finally then developed into a clinical trial, at least we aim to do so, where we investigate the therapeutic potential of the intervention we've been looking at. Now, this approach has been very successful. As I mentioned earlier, there have been several landmark control trials published by our group. For example, in 2001, we published the effect of immune modulating therapy in heart failure patients. In 2005, our group was the first to report the effect of thalidomide in heart failure patients. And now, during the last few years, we've been focusing on the effect of the relationship between inflammation and cardiovascular disease in the transplant setting. And these trials have led to quite significant changes in clinical practice. Here's a list of some other randomized control trials recently completed. As you can see, there's quite a bit of focus on drug trials. However, we do focus on non-pharmaceutical interventions as well, such as high-intensity exercise training. This is a slide that is going to try and introduce you or describe the basic tools we have at our disposal when it comes to cardiac research. We can perform trials looking at, or studies looking at inflammatory biomarkers. We can measure hormonal biomarkers, and we can also look at peripheral gene expression. Then we have the whole range of non-invasive techniques, such as echocardiography, providing anatomical information, imaging in the form of MRI or CT scans, as well as cardiopulmonary exercise testing. And finally, cardiologists do love invasive techniques, and most of them are performed in the cath lab, either in the form of angiography, myocardial biopsies, or indeed intravascular ultrasound, which is my particular area of interest, which is a gold standard technique for assessing and trying to quantify very early changes in the walls of the coronary arteries. And also we have focus on looking at intracoronary physiological assessment, which provides functional information about the vasculature. Just a brief glimpse of some of the publications we've had using these various tools. We've looked at the role of proBNP in the transplant setting, what it means in terms of survival. We've also looked at the whole range of inflammatory biomarkers and how this correlates to the progression of vascular disease. We've also performed studies looking at the role of high-intensity interval training and how this can potentially reduce coronary artery disease. Then we've done studies using intravascular ultrasound. For example, this paper looking at diabetic patients where we did intravascular ultrasound to quantify the extent of vascular disease. And we've also used this tool in the heart transplant setting. And then finally, we're working quite closely with the Stanford group looking at functional assessment using intracoronary physiological assessment. Now, here's a slide showing the connection between the heart and the brain. We're going to be discussing the 4 main pathways. Now, just briefly like to underline that the heart is not purely a pump. It is a complex information processing center that affects brain function and many other organs. The first main communication pathway is neurological pathways. There are clear neurological pathways between the heart and the brain. So this hardware, as you were to call it, is already in place. It is represented by the vagus nerve, which is a parasympathetic innervation, and then you have the sympathetic cardiac nerve. Here's another diagram showing how the information flows in both directions between the heart and the brain. The green here shows information from the heart to the brain, whereas the red line shows the information in the opposite direction. Now, what's interesting to note when it comes to, for example, heart transplant patients, that's a unique patient population that allows us to understand this signaling in one specific way. Because during the process of a transplant, these neurological pathways are cut. there is essentially no neurological connections along the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerves I mentioned earlier on. However, there is still signaling occurring between these two organs, for example, in the form of hormonal signaling. For example, the heart releases atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide, two important hormones. Now, BNP, or brain natriuretic peptide, was previously thought to be released by the brain, but we know that's not correct. We now know it's released by the heart, and it exerts its effect on various organs, including the brain, and ultimately influences sympathetic outflow and peripheral vasculature. The third method is pulse wave signaling. Now, we don't know much about this currently. However, there is evidence that, or we know that with each cardiac systole, with each contraction, what is happening is a specific physical impulse is transmitted along the carotid artery. This influences the perfusion of the brain, but is also likely to represent a form of signaling between these two important organs. And finally, it's a bit speculative but intriguing, the electromagnetic field of the heart. Now, we've extensively, or not we, but many have studied the role of the electromagnetic field of the brain via EEG and other imaging methods. What is less commonly known is that the heart indeed has an electromagnetic field which is 50,000 times stronger than that of the brain. So it's plausible and probable that there is an interaction of these two electromagnetic fields, and it represents a form of communication and signaling between these two organs. Now, essentially, the heart is not a pump, not just purely a pump. It is indeed often called a brain, a second brain of the heart, of the body as well. It has an intrinsic network of neurons. In fact, in 1991, it was already discovered that there are around 40,000 neurons in the heart. And this is represented by the yellow color on this image here. This network is extensive, and it has allowed, or it has led to many researchers calling the heart a brain as well. The heart is often termed intelligent because it demonstrates an ability to function independently. It can sense information, process information, make decisions, and even demonstrates a form of type of learning and memory. And when it comes to this idea of cardiac memory, I just want to share some anecdotes from the field of heart transplant. For example, from South Africa, it was reported that a gentle, soft-spoken lady who never drank alcohol and hated football received a heart transplant from a crashed biker donor. Now, this donor loved both football and alcohol, and the family reported that the recipient's personality changed dramatically. Within a few months, she developed into an aggressive, beer-drinking football fan. The second example is of a 47-year-old male who received the heart of a 17-year-old gentleman. Now, the recipient was never fond of classical music, suddenly developed a keen interest for this. It was later found that it was indeed the donor who loved classical music. He'd played the violin and had actually died in a drive-by shooting, clutching his violin case to his chest. The third example is from pediatric transplant. An 8-year-old girl received the heart of a 10-year-old donor. Now, this girl had horrific nightmares of this event. Professional help was sought with a psychiatrist, and she was able to give such detailed information that the police gathered enough evidence to find the murderer, charge him, and indeed get a conviction for first-degree murder. Now, although these are anecdotes, and of course the value of it can be discussed, however, it does support the idea of a form of cardiac memory. In fact, it has been suggested that the mind is not just in the brain, but does exist throughout the body. So, just to summarize, the heart tells us a lot about what's happening in the brain and vice versa. For example, if we look at the brain, we often use EEGs to measure the electrical activity of the brain. Here we can see something called heartbeat evoked potentials. Now, these are electrophysiological responses in the brain that occur in responses to changes in heart rate and cardiac activity. These HEPs, as they are called, also reflect the cortical processing of cardiac signaling, a form of real-time monitoring, you could say. But it's also been suggested that these are markers of internal body awareness or interoception, or indeed maybe even consciousness. Similarly, the heart can tell us what's happening in the brain. Performing a simple investigation like an EKG, we can measure something called heart rate variability. Now, this is the variation in time between successive heartbeats. HRV, as it is termed, it reflects the interplay between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, of course, represents the form of accelerator of the heart, while the parasympathetic is the braking mechanism. HRV also is related to the activity in certain parts of the brain known as the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which essentially are the emotional processing centers of the brain. We now know that in situations of increased stress or anxiety, heart rate variability goes down, whereas relaxation techniques do indeed increase HRV. So why is heart rate variability important? Well, low heart rate variability is associated with essentially the whole spectrum of cardiac diseases we see, whether that is hypertension, coronary heart disease, heart failure, or indeed arrhythmias. It's also correlated with insomnia, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Now, there's no pharmacological therapy that can improve heart rate variability, at least not yet. So most of the interventions are focused on lifestyle changes, particularly exercise and dietary advice. And this is where yoga comes in. There is evidence showing that yoga can increase heart rate variability, and I'll come back to that later in this talk. Now, the third part of this talk will be discussing or trying to summarize the current evidence of the benefit of yoga on cardiovascular health. And I just want to give you a bit of background, basically, how extensive is cardiac disease? Well, it's estimated that around 600 million people around the world do indeed have cardiovascular disease. Just in the US alone, around $200 billion are spent every year on cardiovascular disease. And when it comes to mortality, the numbers speak for themselves. There's around 18 million deaths happening worldwide due to cardiovascular disease. There's no other condition or ailment which comes even close to that. If you look closely here, even cancer mortality is only at approximately half of that for cardiovascular diseases. So some more bad news. 1 in 3 deaths globally are due to cardiovascular disease. There's 1 death occurring in the US every 34 seconds, which is due to cardiovascular disease. However, there is some good news. About 4 in 5 deaths that are attributable to cardiovascular causes are indeed associated with modifiable risk factors. That means essentially, at least there's the potential to reduce the impact of this disease. As you can see, dietary risks, high cholesterol, smoking, diabetes account for a significant proportion of cardiovascular deaths. So when it comes to the evidence, what exactly do we know about the positive effects of yoga on cardiac diseases? Now, the studies that have been performed can be divided into 2 broad groups. The studies looking at clinical outcomes, and then the studies looking more at the biological effects. And when it comes to clinical outcomes, I'm going to summarize the evidence in terms of hemodynamic improvements, particularly blood pressure, as well as HRV changes. I'll also discuss the effect of yoga on lipids. I'll also talk about the effect of yoga on atherosclerosis directly. And then finally, I'll touch upon the role of yoga with evidence when it comes to yoga on cardiovascular mortality. When it comes to biological effects, I won't have much time to go into all of these. However, I will discuss the current evidence when it comes to the role of yoga or the effect of yoga on inflammation in the cardiovascular setting. So the first endpoint I'd like to discuss is hypertension. And I'm just going to jump to the conclusion, basically. In 2013, the American Heart Association already concluded that transcendental meditation may be considered in clinical practice to lower blood pressure. It was given a Class 2B recommendation, which means that this intervention may be considered, or it can be termed as reasonable to consider, at least in the low-risk setting. Now, this is a game changer because the American Heart Association's guidelines do influence cardiology practice around the world. And suddenly there was a form of legitimacy, you could say, to consider non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as, in this case, transcendental meditation, but also yoga in the broader sense, for low-risk patients. Now, I won't go into the individual studies, but there was an interesting meta-analysis, which is like a summary of, and this came out in 2015, a pooled population of around 1,000 patients. And overall, it was shown that there is a significant reduction in systolic blood pressure associated with yoga. It was shown or quantified at 4 millimeters mercury. Similarly, when it comes to diastolic blood pressure, again, a significant improvement in this variable, and overall a 2 millimeter mercury reduction. Now, many of you may be wondering, these numbers seem very small. However, there's enough evidence that just due to the prevalence of hypertension, this translates into a very significant reduction in both morbidity and mortality. In fact, about a 4 millimeter mercury reduction, which was in this case, does translate into a 10% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, and that's huge. And we could also compare it to certain or well-known drugs of hypertension, such as candesartan or losartan. And these drugs, with all the money that's been pumped into that research, again, on average, show about a similar reduction in blood pressure. So now, heart rate variability. Now, there have been several studies evaluating the effect of yoga on heart rate variability. A comprehensive review was published in 2016. This looked at 15 randomized control trials. They summarized the current evidence and concluded that yoga does indeed increase HRV. They also noted an increased vagal tone was present at rest amongst regular yoga practitioners. Now, from a cardiovascular viewpoint, this is a clear clinical benefit. Just like to share briefly one particular study which was performed amongst patients who already have established cardiac disease. Here, heart failure patients were studied. Patients were randomized to either yoga therapy or standard medical care, and using different parameters of HRV, which I won't go into, it was shown that there was a significant improvement in HRV already at 12 weeks after randomization. And then one more study. This is a paper from 2012. It's a cross-sectional study of Isha yoga that was practiced for a minimum of 6 months. It is a small cross-sectional study, but there were relatively long sessions and a long follow-up period. And again, what they concluded is that yoga was associated with a significant improvement in HRV. So the second endpoint I'd like to discuss is lipid profiles. Now, hyperlipidemia or hypercholesterolemia is a very significant contributor of cardiovascular disease. There have been about 30 trials looking at the effect of yoga and lipid changes. Now, many of these studies are unfortunately limited by the multimodality approach. By that I mean they introduced yoga together with dietary changes or other lifestyle changes, making it a bit difficult to ascertain the independent effect of yoga. Nevertheless, a meta-analysis, which was published earlier this year, of 24 trials summary, 13,000 patients pulled together, showing a significant decline in all lipid parameters. For example, LDL, you're seeing a 7.6 milligram deciliter decline overall. One of the key studies in this meta-analysis is a paper from India. It's a huge paper, that's why I thought I'd bring it up. There's around 11,000 patients included in this trial. These patients had either already an established diagnosis of diabetes or were at high risk of developing diabetes. And after a 3-month follow-up period, they showed a significant improvement in lipid parameters, particularly total cholesterol and LDL. So the findings of this study very much consistent with the meta-analysis results I just discussed. The third endpoint I'd like to discuss is the effect of yoga on atherosclerosis. Now, by atherosclerosis, I'm actually meaning we'd like to see what's happening inside the coronary arteries themselves. Now, there are few studies, if any, which have actually looked at the effect of yoga directly on atherosclerosis per se. The reason for that is to do that, you need to do an angiography. It's an invasive examination. It has its inherent risk factors. So you're unlikely to get ethical approval unless it's a good clinical indication as well. However, therefore, we use non-invasive assessment tools, particularly the ultrasound of the carotid artery. Here we can measure something called intima media thickness. This is shown by the blue on this slide. And essentially, you're measuring what's happening in the wall of the carotid artery. This correlates very closely to what's happening in the coronary arteries, so it's a good marker of it, and also been shown again and again that changes in intima media thickness are directly related to your risk of heart attack, stroke, and overall death. So in terms of that, this paper from 2000 published in Stroke, which is a high-impact journal, looked at the intervention of transcendental meditation for 6 to 9 months. And this is what they showed. Overall, the meditation group had a decline of a reduction in the intima media thickness of 0.01 millimeters, whereas in the control group, there was a progression, an increase of 0.05 millimeters. And this is just within 6 to 9 months. So it's very interesting. And actually, I don't think we've quite understood that what the significance of these findings is, because if you look at the large statin trials, which are dictating clinical practice around the world, even those trials didn't show a change of this magnitude. They're often like one of the landmark trials in 2001 in the Lancet. I think it looked at statin therapy for 2 years, and the overall change was about half of what you're seeing here. So this is certainly could be a big game changer if this is shown again and again in or verified in other studies. Now, the final endpoint I'd like to discuss is cardiovascular mortality. Now, when it comes to cardiology, any trials which are looking at hard endpoints are likely to have a greater impact. And that's why I wanted to spend a bit of time on this paper. It's a large study of 4,000 patients. It did not have any industry support, and it is published in JACC, which is one of the, if not the most high-impact cardiac journals at the moment. Here, patients who had had a heart attack 14 days within a 14-day window were randomized to either standard medical care or yoga therapy. The primary outcome is something we call MACE, which is actually a gold standard endpoint when it comes to cardiology trials. This is a composite endpoint of both mortality, myocardial infarction, stroke, or emergency hospitalization for cardiac cause. And it's a gold standard endpoint because these endpoints are very much undisputable. What did they find? Well, essentially showed there's no difference. According to this paper, which received a lot of attention, there was no clear difference in the two groups. Yoga therapy did not seem to improve outcome after myocardial infarction. But what the authors did find is that amongst a high adherence group, that is patients that practiced yoga for at least 30 minutes or more, there is a clear difference between the two groups. The high adherence group is about 800 patients, so it's a large group. And what you're seeing is a significant benefit in terms of all 4 outcomes. And this is probably why this paper, even though it's a negative study, received a lot of attention from the editors. In fact, they published a separate editorial and concluded, we view this more of a glass half full trial result. And it should also be worth mentioning that many cardiac rehabilitation studies will show there is a differentiated effect according to the adherence to the rehabilitation protocol. So in that sense, the results of the study or the problems as such are also relevant to other cardiac trials. So finally, just want to talk briefly about the link between inflammation and cardiac disease and then ultimately yoga. Now, there's a strong relationship between chronic inflammation and cardiovascular disease. Now, we've shown this and other groups have shown this in all sorts of cardiac populations, whether that is ischemic heart disease, heart failure, or transplant vasculopathy, that is transplant patients. For example, we've measured a whole range of inflammatory markers, simple markers such as CRP, or more advanced markers such as soluble TNF receptor 1 or weak vascular cell adhesion molecule. And we showed there's a very clear association between a high inflammatory drive and the evidence of intimal artery disease. Here we use the gold standard method of intravascular ultrasound, which is a very good technique for identifying early changes. But more importantly, we've shown that reducing this inflammatory drive actually translates into regression of this cardiac disease. And that's where yoga comes in. If it is indeed shown that it can reduce the chronic inflammation or the inflammatory drive, suddenly cardiologists will be interested, because then you're able to probably suggest that it can have a clinical benefit in terms of all sorts of cardiovascular endpoints. And now there's limited trials looking at the effect of yoga on inflammation in a cardiac setting. However, for example, a paper in 2008 looked at heart failure patients and randomized them to either yoga therapy or standard medical care. They measured CRP, IL-6, which are some of the inflammatory markers we've also measured in another setting with other interventions, and showed a significant decline already at 8 weeks after yoga therapy. And then finally, one more paper published in 2021 by Dr. Senthil Kumar and Dr. Bala. Dr. Bala is also here today. Observational study of 632 participants of advanced meditation. And different biomarkers were measured, including markers of diabetes, lipids, as well as inflammatory marker CRP, which we've studied in many other contexts. What they showed is that there was a significantly lower levels of CRP amongst patients practicing advanced meditation. Now, this was already present at inclusion because many of these participants had been practicing advanced meditation before the trial started. But nevertheless, from a cardiovascular viewpoint, very interesting and relevant finding. So how does this all fit together? Well, based on what I'm trying to say this afternoon, I think that yoga therapy can influence cardiovascular disease via 4 main mechanisms. It can affect the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as have a direct effect on stress reduction and inflammatory drive. This in turn can affect the risk of developing modifiable risk factors such as hypertension, hyperlipidemia, insulin sensitivity, high BMI, and other modifiable risk factors. But also they can affect the underlying chronic inflammation, which we know is very closely connected with endothelial dysfunction. And endothelial dysfunction is, as such, probably the final critical pathway for the development of cardiovascular disease, whether that is hypertension, ischemic heart disease, or indeed heart failure. So, future directions. Well, I would suggest that if one's going to look further at the role of yoga on cardiovascular disease, there's 3 main populations one can look at. There's the general population. There are patients with 1 or more established risk factors, such as diabetes. And then there's patients with known cardiovascular disease. Irrespective of which population one looks at, I would suggest one can use the same model. It's important to try to understand the underlying mechanisms on particularly inflammation. This should be accompanied by an objective cardiac assessment, whether that is CT imaging, echocardiography, or indeed heart rate variability. This can be coupled with a functional assessment, for example, cardiopulmonary exercise testing. And finally, any study that is able to include data on hard clinical endpoints, such as MACE, which I discussed earlier, is likely to have a greater clinical impact. So in summary, I would suggest that yoga represents a natural beta blocker of the brain, and the role of beta blockers in terms of cardiology is already well established. Yoga also represents a form of mind-body exercise, and this is particularly relevant to the field in the setting of cardiac rehabilitation. I've shown that there is data demonstrating that yoga can have a potential beneficial effect on blood pressure, lipids, insulin resistance, atherosclerosis, as well as chronic inflammation. And I've also touched upon that cardiac observations do indeed offer a unique opportunity to understand what's happening in the brain. They reflect the direct input and output of the CNS, and these parts of the brain may not be easy to study by other methods. And finally, I think there's a need to further evaluate the effect of yoga on the heart, particularly focusing on the underlying pathways and the role of inflammation. And why I say that is that any information or any more understanding we get of this link of yoga on inflammation is then suddenly relevant to a host of other diseases, because we know cancer, neurological diseases, metabolic diseases, as well as immunological diseases are all heavily driven by a high level of chronic underlying inflammation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arora, for that enlightening talk. Now we'll open the floor for questions. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box, so we can start from there. But if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hand and speak, unmute themselves and ask questions to Dr. Arora directly as well. So we'll start with the first question in the chat box. Duane asks, how do you explain the relationship between the heart and the mind in people with epilepsy? Would treating the heart help with the brain activities?
Wow, interesting question. Epilepsy is not my field, but I think what we're trying to say is, I won't bring up the slide again, but essentially, if you look at the CT scan or the MRI imaging I had, there's several parts of the brain which are involved in the afferent and efferent information processing. And now it would, of course, depend on which parts of the brain are involved in the epilepsy, where the lesions are. But I think it's highly plausible that these pathways are contributing to underlying inflammation and pathological changes in the brain. So if you're able to influence the afferent information, I didn't actually mention earlier, but most of the information that is occurring along these pathways is actually from the heart to the brain and vice versa. So if you're able to mediate what is passing from the heart to the brain, you can probably affect overall cognitive abilities and ultimately, I hope, the symptoms of the epilepsy you're mentioning.
We have Mr. Tilak Verma raising his hand, so we'll not keep him raised.
Thank you for that really elegant talk. I was just wondering how you're defining yoga for the purpose of this presentation. Is it basically hatha yoga? You mentioned meditation. So are other forms of yoga included?
A very good question, very relevant. And I think I wanted to actually talk about that. That is part of the problem with the scientific studies that have been done in the setting of cardiovascular disease. What is yoga? From my presentation here, I try to incorporate all forms of yoga, meaning both the physical aspect, the mind aspect, and other emotional aspects. So trying to incorporate all forms, because I think one shouldn't be limiting it just to hatha yoga, which is more of a physical aspect of it. I mean, yoga, as you're probably aware, is meant to be encompassing all 4 dimensions of well-being. And I think that is gaining more and more recognition. So in terms of the evidence, I'm happy to say that it's not limited just to hatha yoga. It encompasses all the different forms.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have Dr. Kestis, who has raised his hand to ask his question next.
Yeah, very interesting talk. So how do you disentangle the effects of better diets and healthier lifestyle from the effects of yoga? I know you mentioned it, but most programs demand or ask for a change in diet and dietary habits. So how do you disentangle that?
Yeah, very good point. And that's something the American Heart Association had a follow-up statement in 2017, which again highlighted that we have this issue of confounding and cross-linking and cross-talking. Well, what is the independent effect of diet? Well, I mean, that's what yoga is actually. It's a holistic approach. So I'm not sure that trials looking at yoga without dietary changes is the way to go. But of course, documentation, that has been limiting factor so far, that, the trials didn't include data on dietary changes. And it's like, it's not unique to yoga studies. We do have other clinical studies where we have many interacting variables, and that can be filtered out as long as one has the raw data. So I think that's what these protocols need to develop, is more detailed information of exactly these more softer changes in the intervention.
Thank you.
Next question is from Dr. Arun Garg, who asks, what is the link between heart, brain, and mind?
Wow, that's a deep question. Heart, brain, and mind. Well, I'm more focused on the heart, but I would suggest that, it's something we are gaining acceptance. Now, cardiology is a very conservative field as such, very evidence-driven. As I said in some of the trials, unless it's thousands of patients, it doesn't really get accepted in terms of changing clinical practice. But it's interesting to note the shift. It is gaining acceptance, and that's why I think we're gaining acceptance that the mind and the brain are not necessarily the same. The brain would be more the physical aspect. It's an organ, a neurological connection, 86 billion neurons linked to the rest of the body. But ultimately, the mind is more than that, I would suggest. The mind then starts going into more philosophical and maybe spiritual discussions, but ultimately is then connected to overall intelligence, ability to not just process information, but to see things from a greater viewpoint. So, but I think it's just very encouraging that even the conservative field like cardiology is opening up to exploring these relationships.
May I add made a comment to that question, Dr. Arun? Thank you for joining us from Canada. So perhaps you should come to the conference on 26th and 27th to ask this question, because this is exactly what we're trying to explore. Is mind more than the brain, or is brain everything? So I hope you can make it.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I can make it, but if it's on Zoom, I'll definitely try.
There's a live virtual option as well. So It's a
Oh,
light
good.
virtual
Yeah.
option, and we do have experts like Christoph Koch, Rudy Tanzi, and we have Deepak Chopra, and of course Sadhguru was also there. So perhaps this is a question for that panel.
Yeah, maybe you could send me the link, and because this is fundamental for us to bring the change. And so wonderful. Thank you very much for organizing this and letting me know. Thank you.
I'll send that to you, Dr. Arora. Thank you.
I just want to add one small comment. There's also this concept of cardiac intuition, which is being focused more and more onto. First of all, there's cardio-neurology, which is certainly developing into a field focusing on these connections between the heart and the brain. But then there's, still anecdotal and still experimental, where we're seeing that, patients, in the near-death setting, that you can see changes and that correlate between the heart and the brain. And secondly, this idea of cardiac intuition that when you can see suddenly people miss a heartbeat or have the feeling in their heart that some event is about to happen before, as such, the brain is reflecting that. So again, is that reflecting the connection between the heart and the brain just physically, or is it some other dimension that you're potentially tapping into?
So Satish, I also had some follow-up questions on, you talked about immunology piece, and that seems to be a forte in your group's forte that you're working with. What is the connection in your flowchart you mentioned, or in your figure you mentioned, vagus nerve as a connection for the immunological piece? Is that true? Is my understanding right? Is that how it modulates the immunological piece from brain to heart?
That's one of the mechanisms.
And if it is, how does it do it actually?
Well, I don't think we fully understand yet. The problem is that, when I started making that figure, I tried to keep it simple, but the idea is everything is interconnected here. All right. There's one effect of yoga directly on inflammation. There's evidence of that. There's effects of some experimental, very small studies showing, for example, if you look at the nerve growths in the heart, they're affected and they affect inflammation. And that is linked directly to the heart. So that's where you're looking at the autonomic and the nervous system. But there's also likely to be a whole range of peripheral organs involved as well, I would think. And we're still in the early days of understanding this, right? But certainly the easiest to approach is the autonomic nervous system. But having said that, it must be borne in mind when you're looking at the heart, you're measuring the autonomic nervous system, but that's not necessarily directly linked to what's happening in other parts of the organs, right? For example, the autonomic nervous system of the gut will be quite different activity there compared to the heart at the same time. So we still need to filter out what's going on, but I think it's just interesting that the link, is potentially there. Yoga affecting inflammation, and inflammation already accepted as a risk factor, and probably the final common pathway for all cardiac diseases and a whole range of other diseases I talked about.
I also wanted to add to Kestis's question about how do you, disentangle diet and yoga. I believe you can add probably the effect sizes. So in one of the papers that was published by our group in PNAS last year, led by Vijay Chandran, which showed that if you take longitudinal data, blood sampling at baseline, 60 days of yoga, and then 7 days of retreat, then after 3 months. So between the 60 days and the retreat, you could see the incremental effect of yoga itself adding on to the dietary effects. And this was clearly shown in the transcriptomics work that if you kind of do a longitudinal study in that nature, potentially you can disentangle these two mechanisms. But this was published in PNAS, and there was clearly a difference between the dietary effect and the retreat itself. Thank you, Satish. I'll let others ask a question. Thank you.
Are there any RCTs that actually separate these effects, that do, like a diet change arm, yoga, no diet change arm, and so on, that cleanly look at?
When we did the review for answering the reviewers' questions, exactly these were the questions about, how do you disentangle these two pieces? There are no RCTs looking at it, at least to the best of my knowledge. But yes, these are the questions that people want to look at. Like Satish mentioned, yoga is a holistic medicine. You can probably only add the incremental effects. And we have to look at other ways of, intelligently designing the studies. I'm not sure about this, but when we showed this differences between the longitudinal, because samples were taken at 4 different time points, the reviewers agreed.
And I could just briefly add that basically, we are reaching a plateau in terms of the beneficial effect of medical therapy, whether that is statins or hypertensives. So I think that's what the, for example, the American Heart Association is accepting, that yoga is maybe a low-lying fruit, right? It doesn't have to be as an alternative to pharmaceutical therapy. It can be an add-on. And certainly when you're seeing the magnitude of certain, even though they're subtle, because of the scale of the disease, it does certainly have a big impact worldwide, at least.
So we're moving on to the few other questions that we have in the chat box. Mehertad Razavi has asked, what is the most effective form and protocol, duration and frequency of yoga? Example, inner engineering. If Mehrad is online, if she wants to add, if they want to add more to it, or that's all the question that there is for the.
I mean, it's a good point, but ultimately, there are no head-to-head trials of different forms of yoga. We are extrapolating, and that's the problem. Are you comparing like for like? Are you, as Kestas mentioned, there's dietary confounding going on here. So we don't know. It's hard to conclude which is better. But what the American Heart Association, what they did try to do a systematic review. It's a very lengthy document, and did find that certain forms of yoga, particularly the transcendental meditation in that at least in 2013, was shown to have a clinical benefit. Now, this may be absolutely true, but it could also be a reflection of just the different designs of the trials.
Next question from Debakar. Is there any relation with vascular physiology and yoga?
So I'm more of a clinician, but definitely, there's the whole point of mediating the peripheral vascular system is closely intertangled with the neurological pathways and the hormonal signaling, which I mentioned earlier. So just based on involving the heart again, if any intervention is affecting the cardiac function and secretion of, for example, inflammatory mediators or hormonal markers, they're ultimately, again, working downstream on the peripheral vasculature. So definitely, I would say it's most likely going to be an observable effect if one looks into it.
Thank you. Mamta has asked, how can I improve my strength in situations where heavy breathing and consistent breathing is required? For example, during hiking on elevated spaces. Example, during yoga where short, consistent breathing is needed.
I'm not sure I understand the question there.
I think the first part, how can I improve my strength in situations where heavy breathing and consistent breathing is required? And if Mamta is online, if you can unmute and go ahead and ask your questions and to make it more clearer, but this is what she.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think basically there's different studies looking at the intensity of the yoga protocols. Some are pretty advanced, require a lot of practice, but they've also shown that, low intensity, short duration as well, have a beneficial effect. So the differentiate, how much extra effect there is clinically, again, you need a head-to-head trial. But I think, something is likely to be better than nothing is what we already say in clinical practice. Of course, they are established that you should get your heart rate above a certain amount, you should do so many minutes. But there is, from a public health viewpoint, evidence that even low intensity movements and is relevant. And I think that could be extrapolated to yoga as well.
I can partly share my experience about the elevation that she's talking about. I don't know what elevation she's talking about. Is it 10,000 feet, 14,000 feet, 20,000 feet? I'm not sure. But when we did our trek to the 19,000 feet over 3 weeks, they pretty much shut us down from doing any yoga practices from 12,000 feet onwards. So there's no need to do any of those high intense practices that we generally do. Because obviously the density of air gets thinner, and they didn't want us to do any of that. So I don't know what elevated spaces she's asking about, but I can also talk about young people who are college-going students who, for example, take this Shakti Chalana Kriya kind of techniques where you are breathing quite a bit and you're improving almost every lobe of the lung, if you will. And they report that their ability to run from 2 miles to 6 miles just improves. And they immediately want to do it. They're like, okay, I want to take part in half marathon and things like that. I've heard more from a lot of people who are pretty young, like 20 to 25, who do not have any other issues, reporting improved breathing ability and also running marathons, etc.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my question was exactly around that, improving the breathing ability. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. So pardon me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, pronouncing it incorrectly. Noel Hagopian has asked, do you have any studies on sleeping positions and sleeping arrangements in terms of changes in breathing pattern, REM sleep quality?
No, I'm not aware of that, and maybe Dr. Bala would know more about that.
So during the COVID time specifically, special practices were recommended. Essentially prone breathing, you lie down prone position and then you take deeper breaths for simple practices, if you will, that seems to improve your oxygenation, ventilation oxygenation matching. So I see that as a common recommendation that is given. For REM sleep quality, there is an ongoing study that we're doing about assessing the sleep qualities between those who practice some sort of yoga versus those who don't. These are initial results. This is not peer reviewed yet, so take it with a pinch of salt. We do see higher REM sleep in these people, and it's a very shorter time required to go to sleep quickly, and they also very shorter time required to get out of sleep, and they also go into deeper sleep for a long time. So this is an ongoing study. That's a question. REM sleep.
How does HIIT, you said you studied HIIT as well. How does HIIT compare to yoga, and how are they intertwined? Can't hear you.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I was doing this presentation, that we focused a lot on HIIT actually, and we've spent a lot of time looking at the link between this very intensive regime and whether you could, to compare the two interventions, because that's ultimately the only lifestyle modification we've been looking at so far. So from what I've seen, at least of the published literature, the HIIT, of course, is a considerably higher intensity program. But then, having said that, as I do understand that there are many yoga programs that are very, very intense as well. So it's not unthinkable or not unplausible that that you can achieve the same physiological changes with a pretty demanding yoga protocol, at least a hatha yoga program.
Yeah, but HIIT, as I understand, specifically uses intervals, right, with interspersed with rest, whereas yoga, in my understanding, is, at least the physical yoga, is continuous and it can be high intensity. But I mean, I'm definitely not a yoga expert, but it can be difficult, at least it is for me. But it's not rest, go hard and then rest like it is with HIIT.
No, I mean, there's a clear distinguishment between them, right? But are they overlapping in terms of the physiological effects? We don't really know, right? And that's what I think would be interesting to consider, because I think our group was one of the first to look at HIITs in the transplant setting, where it was considered high risk, maybe considered unsafe, but indeed we showed it was both safe and beneficial. So, and that suddenly then makes it relevant to consider maybe even advanced meditative or more demanding physical yoga programs in the cardiac rehabilitation setting.
Right. So we have a couple of minutes left. So for that, I'll just ask the last question. I thought there was someone who raised their hand, but there's one last question. From Charles Sanford. Do the studies indicate yoga as a form of preventative medicine for heart health?
Good question. Good question. And that was one of my slides discussing the 3 different patient populations. If we look at overall the evidence, it's stronger in terms of patients who have established heart disease. And that I think is being recognized. And maybe that is why, the JACC trial showed a clear difference in the adherence group. They were high-risk patients. In fact, they recruited patients within 14 days after a heart attack. If we're looking at the broader population, maybe, there's a whole mixture of patients. I think it's simply a matter of power, actually. It's easier to show an effect amongst patients that are higher risk, at least if you're looking at clear clinical endpoints. If you're looking at more basal sciences, I'm sure you may not see that difference. So the bottom line, and that's something the American Heart Association also said, there is more evidence, more suggestive that it is beneficial amongst patients with established disease that is then secondary prevention than primary prevention.
We had Joseph Diderot. Are you still with us? Who had raised their hand for a question? Probably we lost him. So I think we just have one last question, and that's from me. I'll go ahead. Thank you so much, Dr. Arora, for this talk. I had a question about what is the time duration? How long is the follow-up? Have you been following these patients till seeing the effects carry on for a long time, or? That's my question, like, basically. I'm sorry, I just had to put it on together, like the follow-up period, basically, and the effect of yoga and on the health, cardiac health.
Yeah. So, I mean, as such, we've not done any interventions or any trials based on yoga. We may do in the future, but we'll have to see. We're thinking about that. But if you look at the literature, the follow-up is actually surprisingly short. And that's interesting because, this paper is showing effects, significant effects already at 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 to 9 months. You're seeing benefits which, from a pharmaceutical trial viewpoint, you've had to do trials for maybe 2 to 4 years. So that's very interesting. Now, whether we are able to show the same, that time will tell. But it's I would have expected the opposite, because otherwise, in other lifestyle interventions, you require a much longer follow-up period, at least to see a difference when it comes to clinical endpoints or changes in, for example, the intimal artery thickness.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions. So for the sake of time, we just have a couple of announcements that we want to make. Again, thank you for that enlightening talk. And we had so many questions coming in. Just waiting for this slide to show up. Okay, so join us. So this is everyone. Thank you so much again for being a part of our talk here. Please join us next month for a 2-day conference featuring enlightening discussions and panel sessions with esteemed guests. And please engage in a captivating dialogue between Sadhguru, the globally acclaimed mystic and yogi, and Steven Pinker, a renowned cognitive psychologist. Please don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to expand our knowledge and perspective. And please register now to secure your spot. Next slide, please. And so our center offers wellness programs designed for various populations. We work with population ranging from students, education programs, patient-specific programs, and personal wellness programs. And through evidence-based yoga and meditation practices, all of our programs are thoughtfully curated and delivered online or in person to ensure accessibility and convenience. We also offer customizable programs to suit your specific population. Whether it be teams, leaders, or students, we seek to serve a wide range of communities with programs that meet their needs. So for more information on how you can participate in a wellness program or bring one to your audience or to your loved ones, please find the link to sign up in the Zoom chat, or you can visit our website programs page. Lastly, these are our social media handles on Twitter and LinkedIn, where you may follow us for updates on our center. Be sure to also follow our conference LinkedIn page to receive the most up-to-date information regarding speakers, panels, and registration. Sadhguru Center has launched a monthly newsletter where you'll receive updates on upcoming events, research findings, and highlights from our center, just like today's. This is a way to stay up to date with all of our exciting things happening in the field of science and spirituality. If you're not already part of our mailing list, the link to subscribe is in the chat, and a subscription QR code is on the screen. And with that, just want to let you know that you can reach out to us at Sadhguru Center via email at sadhgurucenter@bidmc.harvard.edu. And we sincerely thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Satish Arora, for your talk. And we look forward to having all of you in our next and subsequent sessions. Thank you so much.